The cemetery gates creaked as Charles Ellington pushed them open, the sound slicing through the heavy silence of the morning. He hated coming here. Not because he didn't miss his son. Ethan's absence was a wound that never healed. But because the weight of his regrets always followed him through these iron gates. 3 years had passed since the accident, and yet the grief clung to him like a shadow. He adjusted his coat, the crisp air biting at his skin, and walked toward the familiar grave, single white rose clutched in his hand. Nathan's headstone stood polished and stark against the dull gray of the morning. Charles knelt, brushing away a fallen leaf from the engraved name. He opened his mouth to speak, to say the words he could never bring himself to say when Nathan was alive. Sorry, should have been there more. But before he could utter a syllable, a sound stopped him, a soft, muffled sob. His head snapped up. A woman knelt just a few feet away, her back to him, her shoulders trembling. A small child, no older than 4, clung to her side, his tiny fingers gripping her sleeve. The boy's eyes wide, curious, and achingly familiar, locked onto Charles for a brief second before he buried his face against the woman's shoulder. Charles's breath hitched. There was something about the boy's face, the way his nose scrunched when he frowned, that sent a jolt through him. The woman turned, startled, her tear-streaked face pale with surprise. I didn't realize anyone else would be here," she whispered, hastily wiping her cheeks. Her gaze flickered between Charles and the grave as if she were weighing whether to flee. Charles stood slowly, his mind racing. Who was she? Was she crying at his son's grave? And who was the boy? The questions burned in his throat, but all he managed was a stiff, "Did you know Nathan?" The woman hesitated. Then, with a quiet resolve, she nodded. "Yes, my name is Emily, and this is Liam." The way she said it, the protective way her arm tightened around the boy, sent a chill down Charles's spine. Because in that moment, as Liam peeked up at him again, Charles saw it. The same dimple in the left cheek, yet the same sharp, bright eyes. His son's eyes. Charles stared at the boy, his pulse hammering in his ears. The resemblance was uncanny, the way Liam's brow furrowed when he was nervous. The slight tilt of his head, it was like staring at a ghost of Nathan as a child. His throat tightened, and for a moment he couldn't speak. Emily's grip on Liam's shoulder tightened, her knuckles whitening, as if she were bracing herself for an explosion. But Charles wasn't angry. He was lost. "How?" The words slipped out, rough and unsteady. Emily's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes darting toward the grave and back to him. "Nathan never mentioned you," Charles continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Never." The unspoken accusation hung between them. Were you a secret? A mistake? But Emily's expression hardened, defiance flashing in her damp eyes. "He was going too," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "The night he died, was on his way to tell you everything." The words hit Charles. Like a physical blow, he staggered back a step, the white rose slipping from his fingers onto the grass. The night he died. The accident had been late, the roads slick with rain. Nathan's car had skidded off an overpass, the impact crushing. The vehicle beyond recognition. The police had called it a tragic loss of control. But now? Now, Charles wondered? His mind raced, fragments of the past resurfacing Nathan's nervous energy in the days before the crash. The way he'd hesitated during their last phone call as if he wanted to say something but couldn't. Had it been about them? Emily bent down to pick up the rose, her fingers brushing the petals gently before handing it back to him. The gesture was small, but it shattered something in Charles. This woman, this stranger, knew his son's grave well enough to treat it with the same quiet reverence he did. "We should talk," he said abruptly, the billionaire's command slipping into his tone despite himself. "Not here. Somewhere." Emily hesitated, her gaze flicking to Liam, who was now crouched in the grass. Poking at a beetle with a stick, innocent, unaware. She nodded once. "All right, but not today. He's had enough for one morning." Charles clenched his jaw but didn't argue, pulled a platinum business card from his coat pocket and pressed it into her palm. "Tomorrow, my driver will pick you up." Emily stared at the card, her thumb tracing the embossed letters. For a second, He thought she might refuse. Then she tucked it into her pocket without a word, took Liam's hand, and walked away. Charles watched them go, the boy skipping beside her, his laughter floating back like a cruel reminder of everything he'd never known. That night, Charles didn't sleep. He sat in his penthouse study, the city lights blurring beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, and pored over every photo, every email, every trace of Nathan's life he could find. There had to be clues. A hidden apartment lease, bank statements. For gifts he hadn't known about? But there was nothing. Could Nathan have hidden a whole family? The question gnawed at him. And then there was the other thought, the one that slithered in darker. What if he hadn't just been hiding them? What if he'd been protecting them? The accident report had always felt off. It's clean, too convenient. Charles had been too, grief-stricken to question it then, but now. Now he needed answers. The chauffeured-driven car arrived precisely at 10 the next morning, its black exterior gleaming under the pale sunlight. Emily had spent the night tossing and turning, torn between fear and a desperate need for answers. Liam, oblivious to the tension, had chattered excitedly about the big fancy car coming to pick them up, small fingers clutching the stuffed dinosaur Nathan had given him years ago, the one he refused to sleep without. As the car glided through the city, Emily watched the towering skyscrapers pass by, their glass facades reflecting a world that felt alien to her. She had worked 2 jobs just to keep a roof over Liam's head, while Charles Ellington's name was etched on half the buildings they drove past. The inequality of it all burned in her chest, but she swallowed it down. This wasn't about money. This was about Liam, about Nathan. The car stopped in front of a discreet, high-security building, not Ellington's corporate headquarters, but a private residence, sleek and imposing. A butler ushered them inside, where the air smelled of leather and aged whiskey. Charles stood by the fireplace, his posture rigid, his eyes immediately locking onto Liam. The boy shrank back, pressing against Emily's leg. "It's okay," she murmured, running a hand through his hair. "Remember what I told you? This man knew your daddy." Liam peeked up at Charles, curiosity battling shyness. "You knew my dad?" he asked, his voice small. Charles's stern expression faltered for a fraction of a second as he said the word rough. "Yes, very well." Coffee was served in, elaborate spread of pastries and fruit that Liam eyed with wide-eyed wonder, but neither adult touched theirs. Emily went straight to the point. She pulled a worn envelope from her bag and slid it across the table. "Nathan wanted you to have this? He wrote it the day before?" She trailed off, but Charles understood. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the letter. Nathan's handwriting, so familiar yet so painfully distant, stared back at him. "Dad," the letter began. "If you're reading this, it means I've finally worked up the courage to tell you the truth. I have a son. His name is Liam. His mother, Emily, is the best thing that ever happened to me. I know this will shock you. I know you'll have questions. But please meet them before you judge. Liam looks just like I did at his age. He even has your stubborn chin." Charles's breath caught. "I was scared to tell you because I didn't want him growing up in our world of boardrooms and backstabbing. But he deserves to know his family. And you deserve to know him." The letter ended there. No dramatic farewell, just Nathan's hurried signature. Charles read it 3 times before lowering it. His voice was dangerously quiet when he finally spoke. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Emily's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. "I tried. After the funeral, I reached out to your office. Your assistant told me you weren't seeing anyone. Then the private investigator I hired warned me to stay away." Charles's head snapped up. "What investigator?" Emily met his gaze. "The one I hired after the police closed the case. The one who told me Nathan's brakes had been tampered with." The room went deathly silent. Even Liam, now nibbling on a croissant, seemed to sense the shift in the air. Charles's face drained of color. "You're saying someone murdered my son?" It wasn't a question. Emily nodded slowly. "I think they'll come for Liam next if they find out who he is." The moment the words left Emily's lips, Charles felt the ground shift beneath him. Murder. Not an accident. not a tragic twist of fate, but something deliberate, calculated in execution disguised as misfortune. His hands curled into fists, his mind already racing through a list of names, faces, men who had clashed with him over the years, men ruthless enough to strike at him through his son. The thought made bile rise in his throat. He had spent decades building an empire, believing his wealth and influence could shield his family from harm. But Nathan had died unprotected, unknowing. And now this woman, this stranger who had loved his son in ways he hadn't, was telling him the danger wasn't over. Liam's voice, bright and oblivious, cut through the tension. "Mommy, can I have more juice?" Emily's attention snapped back to him, her face softening as she poured the drink with hands that only shook a little. Charles watched the interaction, something tightening in his chest. This child, his grandson, had been living in the shadows. For years, while he'd sat in penthouses and boardrooms, unaware that a piece of Nathan still existed in the world. The guilt was a physical weight, but beneath it, something else stirred. A protectiveness so fierce it startled him. He stood abruptly, startling both Emily and Liam. "We're leaving," he said. Emily's eyes widened. "What? This isn't safe," Charles said, already striding toward the intercom on the wall. "If what you're saying is true, then every second we sit here is a risk. I have a property upstate completely secure. We'll go there while I look into this." Emily hesitated, her grip tightening on Liam's shoulder. "I don't even know you," she said quietly. Charles met her gaze. "You knew Nathan. That's enough for now." 3 hours later, they were in a helicopter, Liam's first ride. His fear quickly overtaken by wonder as he pressed his face to the window, giggling as the city shrank beneath them. Charles watched him, something unclenching in his chest at the boy's joy. Emily, though, sat stiffly, her eyes darting between Liam and Charles as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. The estate was sprawling. Hidden behind gates and dense forest, its security system, state-of-the-art. As they were shown to their rooms, Liam's already stocked with toys, detail Charles had quietly insisted, and Emily finally broke. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You could have just demanded a paternity test, thrown money at us to go away. Why all of this?" Charles was silent for a long moment. Then, quietly, "Because I failed him once. I won't fail him again." That night, while Liam slept, curled around his stuffed dinosaur, Charles and Emily sat in the study, surrounded by files. She had brought everything: the investigators' notes, the police report with its inconsistencies, the receipts from Nathan's last days. Piece by piece, a picture emerged. Nathan had been digging into something. Something tied to one of Charles's oldest rivals, a man named Victor Haas. Haas had lost millions in a deal Charles had orchestrated years ago, and his threats had been vicious, but Charles had dismissed them as the ravings of a sore loser. Now, he wondered. Emily's voice was hollow. "Nathan told me he'd found something. He said he needed to talk to you before it was too late." She swallowed hard. Next morning, he was dead. Charles's jaw tightened. Then we start with Haas. The private investigator's report was spread across Charles' mahogany desk, each page a fresh punch to the gut. Victor Haas hadn't just threatened Nathan, he'd been systematically tracking him for months. Security footage, which the police had inexplicably lost, showed a black SUV tailing Nathan's movements in the weeks before the crash. Credit card receipts placed Haas associates at the same quiet Italian restaurant where Nathan had his last meal. The most damning evidence? A $250,000 wire transfer from a shell company to a mechanic specializing in automotive diagnostics, paid out 3 days before Nathan's brakes failed on that rain-slicked overpass. Charles' hands shook as he examined the mechanic's statement, coerced from the man by a private security team just that afternoon. "I didn't know they were going to kill nobody," the man had sobbed. "They just said the rich kid needed a scare." The tumbler of whiskey in Charles' hand shattered against the stone fireplace, making Emily jump from her seat across the room. "A scare?" Charles' voice was dangerously quiet. "They murdered my son over a goddamn scare." Liam's sudden appearance in the doorway froze them both. The boy clutched his dinosaur, sleep-tousled and rubbing his eyes. Grandpa Charlie? The title, so innocent and unexpected, sliced through Charles' rage like a knife. He hadn't corrected Liam when the boy had. Started using it that afternoon, hadn't realized how desperately he'd needed to hear it until now. I had a bad dream, Liam whispered, small feet padding across the Persian rug. In that moment, Charles did something he hadn't done since Nathan was a child. He knelt and opened his arms.
Oh.
Liam barreled into him without hesitation, his warm weight pressing against Charles' chest in a way that made his throat tighten. Over the boy's head, Charles locked eyes with Emily. She looked as stunned as he felt. "We need to end this," he mouthed. She nodded, her hands twisting in her lap. Haas wouldn't stop coming, not now that he knew Nathan had left an heir. The police had failed. Justice system had failed. But Charles Ellington still had resources. They couldn't imagine at 3:17 a.m. While Liam slept curled against Charles' side in the oversized study chair, the billionaire made 3 phone calls. The first was to his chief counsel, instructing him to fast-track Liam's paternity documentation and inheritance rights. The second was to his head of security, authorizing measures he'd never thought himself capable of. The third was to a private number in Switzerland, where a certain safety deposit box contained files on every business rival he'd ever faced, including the photographs of Haas' teenage son attending an elite private school outside Zurich. "Play the game your way, Victor," Charles whispered into the darkness, one hand absently stroking Liam's hair. "But I invented the rules." The morning dawned with deceptive calm. Charles stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the safe house, watching the mist curl through the pine trees as Liam's laughter echoed from the kitchen where Emily was fixing pancakes. The scent of maple syrup and coffee should have felt comforting, but every nerve in Charles' body was live wire. His security team had moved like ghosts through the night, repositioning sensors, planting false trails, ensuring Haas men would walk right into the snare he'd set. At 9:47 a.m., the first alert chimed on his encrypted tablet. A black Range Rover with diplomatic plates had just passed through the nearest town 20 miles out. Charles' mouth curled into a humorless smile. Haas was getting sloppy, or desperate. He turned to find Emily watching him, her face pale but determined. She'd changed since arriving here. The frightened woman from the cemetery replaced by someone far more dangerous, a mother with nothing left to lose. "They're coming, aren't they?" she asked quietly, keeping her voice low so Liam wouldn't hear. Charles nodded once, on schedule. The next 93 minutes passed with excruciating tension. Liam, blissfully unaware, built an elaborate fort in the living room, using every cushion in the house. Emily moved through the rooms like a shadow, checking exits, memorizing weapon placements, monitored the security feeds, watching for heat signatures approach through the woods. Not Haas himself, of course. The man was too smart for that. But professionals? Armed and undoubtedly instructed to leave no witnesses. When the first window sensor tripped, Charles didn't flinch. He simply pressed a button on his phone and watched as the estate's hidden defenses activated. The would-be assassins never saw the stun nets dropping from the trees, never anticipated the tranquilizer darts fired from automated turrets concealed in the garden statues. One man managed to trigger the panic button on his Cums device before collapsing exactly as Charles had hoped. Downstairs, the doorbell rang. Emily gasped as Charles calmly checked the monitor showing Victor Haas himself standing at their gates. His face twisted in fury. "You arrogant bastard," Haas spat at the camera. "You think this changes anything? I'll burn your entire bloodline to the." Charles muted the feed and turned to Emily.
Oh.
"Take Liam to the panic room. Now." As she scooped up their bewildered grandson, Charles allowed himself one final glance at the family he'd almost lost twice over. Then he straightened his tie, palmed the small pistol from his desk drawer, went to finally have his reckoning. The game wasn't over yet. The gates slid open with a quiet hum, and Charles stepped into the morning light to face the man who had taken his son. Victor Haas stood flanked by 2 bodyguards, his tailored suit at odds with the wild fury in his eyes. The billionaire looked older than Charles, remembered deep lines of desperation carved around his mouth. his once impeccable posture sagging under the weight of his own recklessness. "You shouldn't have come yourself," Charles said, his voice eerily calm. "That was always your problem, Victor." Too hands-on. Haas's lip curled. "Did you really think I'd let you walk away after this? After what you've done?" His gaze flickered toward the house, where Emily and Liam were hidden behind 3 inches of bulletproof steel. "That boy is the last piece of Nathan. And I made sure nothing of yours survives." A cold ripple passed through Charles. There was something in the way Haas said it, too satisfied, too certain. Then the realization hit. It's a Range Rover in town. The men in the woods, they had been a distraction. Haas wasn't here to kill Liam. He was here to watch. Charles braked when he realized he'd already failed. Charles's phone buzzed, a single alert from his security chief. The message was only 3 words. "Breach at Zurich." Haas smiled, slow and venomous. "Did you really think I wouldn't know about the files? About your little insurance policy?" His laugh was a dry, hollow thing. "My son is on a plane to Buenos Aires. Yours is still in the ground." For the first time in his life, Charles Ellington understood what it meant to truly want to kill someone. His fingers twitched toward the pistol in his pocket. It would be so easy, one shot between those mocking eyes, and Haas would never threaten his family again. But then he heard it. A small voice from the terrace above them. "Grandpa Charlie." Liam stood at the railing, his dinosaur dangling from one hand, his hair tousled from the panic room's blankets. Emily was just behind him, her face pale with fear. Haas's bodyguards tensed, their hands moving toward their weapons. Time slowed. Charles made his choice. He stepped back, raising both hands in plain view. "Security lockdown Gamma," he said clearly. The estate's automated system recognized his voice command instantly. A series of heavy thunks echoed as every door and window sealed. Haas's smug expression faltered as he realized he was trapped. Inside with a man who had nothing left to lose, Charles didn't reach for the gun. He reached for his phone and pressed play on a file his investigators had unearthed just that morning. Nathan's voice filled the air, crisp and clear from a hidden recorder. "Haas is moving money through the Cayman shell companies. It's not just embezzlement, it's terrorism financing. I've got proof. If anything happens to me, it's all in the recording cut off abruptly." Haas's face went ashen. That proof, the real reason Nathan had been killed, wasn't in Switzerland anymore. Charles smiled. "It's already been sent to Interpol. You're not just a murderer, Victor. You're a dead man walking." Sirens wailed in the distance. Haas lunged, but Charles was ready. The pistol was in his hand now, not to fire, but to strike a brutal blow across Haas's temple that sent the man crumpling to the gravel. The bodyguards froze as red laser dots danced across their chest. Charles's sniper team. Finally in position by the time the police arrived, Charles was sitting on the terrace steps with Liam in his lap, explaining in simple terms why bad men sometimes needed to go away for a very long time. Emily watched them, tears streaking her face. But she wasn't afraid anymore. Later, when the reporters asked why he'd risked everything, Charles would say only this: "I was a billionaire long before I was a grandfather. Only one of those titles ever mattered." And when Liam, years later, would take over the foundation named for the father he never knew, people would remark how his hands moved just like his grandfather's when he signed important documents, steady, sure, and unafraid.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.